Hi everyone. In this mini lesson, we're trying to transition from looking at those primary documents to taking a step back and looking at the changes in America between 1775, which would have been at the beginning of the American Revolution, to 1877, which is when a lot of historians characterize the end of the Reconstruction, which was the time period following the Civil War. Today's mini lesson is based off of two learning targets. They're pretty similar, and you're going to have an opportunity to do a little bit more of an investigation into what these are actually talking about through a timeline project for this lesson. The first learning target states I can use the American Revolution, Constitution, and Civil War to develop an argument about key players and changes in American society. So, in that learning target, you're covering a pretty significant span of time, almost 100 years. The American Revolution begins in 1775, and the Civil War doesn't end until 1865. So, you're looking at 90 years worth of history. The second learning target states I can analyze how changing character of American political society from 1791 to 1877 influenced federalism. So, in that learning target, you're looking at roughly the same time period. However, you're specifically focusing on the division of power between the federal government and the state governments. So, the first kind of segment of this lesson is going to be based on the American Revolution, also known as the Revolutionary War. So, as previously stated, the American Revolution was fought from 1775, when the first battle broke out at Lexington and Concord, until 1783. However, most of the official battles ended in 1781. It took nearly 2 years for the Treaty of Paris to officially get signed, ending the war. The American Revolution represented the Founding Fathers' attempt to challenge existing politics. They were looking at the conditions of the 13 colonies under Great Britain and largely blamed King George III for a lot of things. In the Declaration of Independence, they expressed their extreme concern of the condition of the country, including complaints about things like taxation without representation, cutting off trade from a majority of the rest of the world, their governors having limited to no power in terms of enforcing local politics. At this time, we see the emergence of some major players that not only play a role in the American Revolution, but also play a role in the government that developed afterwards. George Washington was one of the major military leaders of the war. George Washington became a household name after his involvement in the French and Indian War that was fought roughly 10 years before the Revolutionary War broke out. At the time, George Washington had been extremely young, but by the time the American Revolution breaks out, he is a seasoned military general. And not only is he someone that they trust on the battlefield, he is also a name that they trust in terms of politics. Thomas Jefferson never actually fought in the American Revolution. However, he was instrumental to this time period because he both helped to draft the Declaration of Independence and is often credited as being the major contributor of the Declaration of Independence. And he went to France to gain support from foreign affairs. Benjamin Franklin would have been extremely old at this time. However, he also helped to write the Declaration of Independence. He was on a committee of five with Thomas Jefferson, and he also helped to form the draft of the Articles of Confederation, which was the initial constitution created after the war ended. So, the American Revolution is especially important because it created a democratic government. When the colonists broke away from Great Britain, they knew what they didn't want. They didn't want a overly controlling government with one person with ultimate responsibility. Consequently, they wanted to create a democracy which was based on voting. However, it took some time for them to really flush out what this would look like. The Constitution was not initially discussed until 1787. So, as I talked about before, from 1781 to 1787, the United States is run under a document called the Articles of Confederation. In a lot of ways, the Articles of Confederation was the first draft of the Constitution in the United States. The Articles of Confederation had a lot of flaws, though. It did not have a president, it did not have a Supreme Court system, it did not have a way to create taxes. It did not have a way to formally create a military or require people to send people to be part of the federal army. It did not have a way to easily create new federal laws that all the states were agreeing to create because it required 9 out of the 13 states to agree. Consequently, in 1787, they came together at a meeting which would later be tagged the Constitutional Convention to discuss the future of the country. This begins a long series of arguments and debates about what they wanted the country to become, and eventually they decide instead of fixing the Articles of Confederation, which would have required a lot of agreement between different states, they would create a new constitution. In 1789, it is officially ratified by signatures from all 13 of the states. There are a lot of key figures known collectively as the founding fathers during this time period. However, there are three that especially stand out in gaining support for the Constitution. These are James Madison, who would eventually become President of the United States, Alexander Hamilton, who was the first Secretary of Treasury under George Washington, John Adams, who would also eventually become president. This created the framework of government. The Constitution is broken down into 5 articles. Article 1 spells out the responsibilities of the legislative branch, which is made up of the House of Representatives and the Senate. Article 2 spells out the responsibilities of the executive branch, which includes the president, the vice president, and the president's cabinet. And Article 3 spells out the rules and responsibilities of the judicial branch, which includes the Supreme Court and other federal court systems. More specifically, it created a federal system. We'll talk more about federal system in a moment, but a federal system is defined as a government which includes a separation of power between the federal government and the state governments. So when you look at Article 4 of the Constitution, it talks about the division of power between the federal government and the individual states. Now we're jumping a little bit further ahead in history to the Civil War. The Civil War is officially fought from 1861 to 1865. Other than military generals, Abraham Lincoln is credited as being the most important political figure in terms of the war. He largely helps to voice the shift in what the war is being fought from, which originally was to gain the southern states back to be part of the Union, to being formally about slavery. The Civil War demonstrated a tension between the federal and state governments because the state governments largely rebelled in the South because they did not feel that they were being protected under the federal government because there were discussions of ending slavery. And so we see this division of power between the federal and the state governments, especially as there were a lot of arguments between the free and non free slaves. This leads to the abolition of slavery and demonstrates the overall power of the federal government. So now we're going to look specifically at federalism during this time period. So we're looking between 1791, which would have been just after the Constitution is officially ratified, to 1877, which would have been following the end of the Civil War Reconstruction. First of all, let's look at the definition of federalism. By definition, the term federalism is talking about the separation of power between federal and state governments. In the United States, there is a formal division of power between the responsibilities and rules of what the federal government can do, including the 3 branches, and what the state governments can do. So, for example, the federal government is responsible for things like national protection or the military. They're responsible for things like creating and enforcing amendments to the Constitution. They're responsible for international relationships with other countries. At the state level, the government has other responsibilities, including things like road construction or education, things that have more of a local importance. However, the enforcement of federalism and the interpretation of the Constitution's portion that focuses on this division of power has been interpreted differently over time. So, it was initially established in the Constitution, which was ratified in 1789. The Constitution established a federal government. So, under the Articles of Confederation, it had a very weak federal government. There was a legislative branch. However, the Constitution now created the 3 branches of government, which allowed for a president and then it allowed for a Supreme Court to be developed. However, even after the Constitution is formally ratified, there's a lot of debate about whether the Constitution should be followed as is, or if changes should be made, or how much power that federal government should really have. This leads to a division of the country between Alexander Hamilton, who is George Washington's Secretary of Treasury, and Thomas Jefferson, who is George Washington's Secretary of State. Hamilton highly supports a strong central government and feels that that's the only way that things get done. He advocates for a central bank and an expansion of power than those that are specifically stated under the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson largely felt that if the federal government became too powerful, it could impact the southern states, especially in negative ways, and strongly advocated for more state rights than federal rights. Fast forward to the Civil War. Slavery causes a division between the free and enslaved states. While there are people on both ends of the slavery debate in individual states, for the most part, there is a division between the northern states and the southern states. This ultimately shows the supremacy of the federal government because ultimately, after the war ends, the Union wins. The southern states have to rejoin the Union, and consequently, it shows that the federal government does have the power to get rid of things like slavery. Flash forward just a couple years to the passage of the 14th Amendment. This is expanding federal protection and basically the role that the federal government is playing in things. You will, y- as you looked at with the interpretation of the 14th Amendment, it talked about how the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were different because it was more talking about what people couldn't do to one another than talking about what the federal government could or couldn't do. So, again, we see this expansion of what the federal government is capable of enforcing.